All right, I think I'll get started. You can hear me at the back okay, Dan? Everything's good? Cool. Yeah. All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session on, it's got a nice long title, Beyond the Code, defining and packaging and versioning services for PaaS OE. My name is Peter Judge. I'm an engineer at Progress. I work in the development group, and I do fun things like this. I don't build the PaaS team. Those are the guys sitting at the back there, so you can direct all the questions at them. I'll just point them out in advance. But I kind of help with figuring out how we make PaaS OE usable in a lot of ways. This is somewhat of a project I'm working on with them at the moment, is working on deployment stuff in a more modern world. So what are we going to talk about a little bit? Some background about application architectures. I'm sorry, I'm officially an architect, so I get to draw lots of boxes and lines and diagrams and talk to you about them. And just kind of, what have you got? How do we expose that as services in PaaS? And what does that mean in terms of the deployment, right? Does everybody use PaaS? All right, good, so most people. And so I'm not going to go into too many details of the runtime of PaaS, how it hangs together and the agents and all of that sort of stuff, but we'll talk about what it means to deploy to PaaS and what the pieces are. Not going to talk about how to write applications, not going to talk about how to do security, because we'd be here all week. All monitoring and administration, right? This is just starting with code you have, applications you have, how do you get them into PaaS, how do you deploy them there, how do you package them for deployment there. If you have questions during, feel free to ask, interrupt, heckle, don't throw things, but any comments are welcome. All right, so basically, we all have applications, right? In our world, they're ABL applications. They more or less look something like this. So for today's purposes, we will look at them like this. We have an application, which is a set of components, service interfaces, which is how, we'll go into detail of what those are, but that's how the world talks to us, business logic, right? The stuff we've written for 1,000 years, and database at the back. And there's a whole bunch of different pieces of this that make up an application. You can't just say my application is just code. Because it's code, it's database, it's schema files, it's properties, it's connection parameters, it's security configuration. There may be scripts when you tailor it, right? When you do an install, how do you tailor it to the client side? How many people in here roughly are ISVs? So you do deployments and you sell out. So about half, I think. So you know that there's more involved in getting the stuff deployed out than just dropping files on disk. My first deployment was FTP to the server and just copy the code over there and then, hope it doesn't break anything. So we'll look at what these things are and, how this maps to PaaS. On the service interface layer, and this is kind of the bit we'll talk a little bit in detail about, but that's how you get in, right? That's not the code itself. It's not your MRP or your shipping app or your document management or whatever, your pension funds. It's just you get a request from somewhere. That somewhere could be a SOAP client, it could be a web browser, it could be a 4GL, an ABL client, right? How do you take that and translate that back into your business logic code? And in kind of the PaaS world, we'll talk about it in two ways. One is the API, the URIs and the HTTP methods, particularly because PaaS is a web server. And then the service interfaces, which take those requests and translate them to business logic. So for instance, I'm not even going to ask, but everybody uses temp tables, right? Temp tables are used to work with data, pass data around. When you get a request from the web browser, it's in JSON format, right? Now that may or may not be the format that Progress expects, the temp table format. If it is, it's easy conversion, but you may need to convert that JSON data you get from a put request or post or whatever it is, and turn it into a data set which your business logic uses. And you don't want to have to, and you're going to want to do that per client. So my kind of little analogy is, if you think about electricity, right? Your app's more or less electricity, and the way you get in and out of where you get the electricity out is you plug it in, right? And there's an adapter, there's a socket and a plug, and they work together to get the data in and out. So an API and a service interface. And you can have multiple different ones. So you can have these kind of American-style ones, but in the room you could also have a USB port, which is a different service adapter, service interface to the same stuff. Okay. Service interfaces are also responsible for things like authentication, authorization, error handling, data, not cleaning data, but making sure the data is well formatted, that sort of stuff, right? That's kind of your outer layer of protection. Inside of this, we've got the stuff we know and love, right? Business logic. In our world, it's ABL, database, etc. And there's also going to be shared libraries. And I'm just showing this for kind of completeness, because this has a place in PaaS. And we'll talk a little bit about bundling and shipping that off to PaaS as well. How can we do that, and where should that go? Okay. Right. So in ABL or PaaS terms, we've got, well, ABL terms really, OpenEdge terms, we've got a bunch of service interface approaches, and these are all kind of on the REST-y side. SOAP still exists, and we'll touch on it briefly, but the newest one, or the newer ones, are in the web side. And they're kind of split into two pieces. Where you see REST here and here, there's a bunch of Java code that does the web app, in Tomcat terms, does a lot of the work of the service interface and passes that through to your ABL. The web handler approaches, these three over here, they all work on ABL code. So far more of the code is in ABL than it is in Java. And there's pros and cons to both of these approaches. I prefer the ABL approach because that's my background. I'm a programmer, so I like to see all of this stuff coming and going. The downside of that, of course, is you have to do a whole bunch of, you tend to land up writing a lot of work, a lot of code to be able to do this stuff. So these data objects we have here is kind of our prescriptive approach. You may have heard of them. We've called them a number of things over the years. Data object services have a prescriptive URL, prescriptive payload. They're quite a rigid way of doing things. It's not a real REST-y API, but it's a REST API nonetheless. Yeah, so URI is content type, it's only JSON. The difference between these two, I think I'll click through, is just what is the service interface written in. In this world, it's written as a web handler, which is ABL code. In this world, it's a Java thing. Same kind of stuff. And they use what's called a catalog, which is somewhat like a Swagger document, which basically tells a client, hey, these are the URLs, this is where this stuff is, this is what the data format is it's expecting, this is what you're going to get back, right? It's not to say you can't call that stuff without these endpoints, right? Because it's just built on with the web, on HTTP, but that's what they give you. And this is our default suggested straight out of the box approach, right? If you say new service in PDSOE, this is what you'll get, pretty much by default. The map REST approach, and you can kind of see at the bottom, is really old. PaaS-OE was introduced in 11.5. Some of these are older. Like this was our REST adapter. You needed to install and run your own version of Tomcat, and it talked to a classic app server, and it had a whole, well, probably fewer moving parts than PaaS, but a whole bunch of similar moving parts that aren't bundled into the product. On the REST side, you've got far more flexibility about the URLs or the URIs, so you can do, /customers, /12345 /orders. You can map that out and have that as a real REST-y API. It was also limited to JSON, or is, I should say, limited to JSON. It uses a graphical mapping tool, which is, I'm trying to think of the right word to describe it, but it's not really fun to use on any kind of scale. It's fine for picking up, doing small things, but if you're trying to build out a bunch of services, it's tricky, or it's not fun. Finally, the kind of last one, we have web handlers, and web handlers is just an ABL approach. It's effectively an interface that you need to implement with one method in it, and that all requests flow into that. So you get one method, and you can do whatever you want at that point. So you can write a very generic one, which is what we've written, which is the data object handler, or you can write a very specific one. So if you've got specific handling you need to do for image processing or PDF document processing or something, you could write one that just handles that type of stuff, and then the code is very tight, very, follows good coding practice in the sense of it just does one thing. We provide a bunch of them. There's 3 or 4 in the box, 4 or 5 in the box now. And you can do, I say, what you want. Content types is up to you. URIs are up to you. You get a whole huge range of flexibility over how you want to implement your API. And finally, the data object handler is one we ship that underpins this data object, but because of some of the architecture of the data objects, it has to be able to do a whole bunch of stuff. And this is effectively the same as this REST mapping tool, but it uses a JSON file to tell the requests where to come and go. So these are, again, a plumbing approach. I should also mention that you could have one of each of these on top of the same piece of P code or class file for your business logic. Just as there's nothing to say that your order API, or sorry, your order business logic needs to have one and only one set of APIs. So for instance, if you're building UI, you could build a bunch of services with the data objects on top of that, because the catalog and the JSDO component in JavaScript knows how to read that and does a whole bunch of stuff for you, and that's nice, right? You can build nice grid-based UIs on that. But you may want to provide a simpler API to get just one customer, for instance, and then you could add your own web handler or another approach on the same piece of business logic. Okay, so far so good. Excellent. So this is kind of how and again, this is straight from my head onto the slides, how I look at what an instance is. So from the outside, we've got this kind of an instance contains an application, business application, or ABL application, we'll talk about it as. Within there, we get a web app, which is effectively your API, and a service in there, your service interfaces running on top of whatever code you put in the back of it, on whatever agents run. This is what you get when you do a TCMan create. TCMan if you work with PaaS, you'll use that a lot. It's kind of the Swiss Army knife tool. It does a whole bunch of things. It creates stuff, it starts things, it stops things, it deploys stuff. When you work with PaaS, you'll get very used to using it. So when we create it, we get an instance, and we'll talk about what these individual layers are in more detail, with an ABL application, with a web app. I think we deploy one service by default or some services by default, and then code in the back. All right. So what we can also do in PaaS, because it's built on Tomcat, what's nice is we can run what I'm calling independent or standard or separate or non-ABL. I don't know the best adjective for them, but they don't run ABL business logic. So we can put these independent ones, various management things. Health Scanner is a new one in 12, I believe. Debug tools, Corticon if you want. You can even put your web UI in there into the same server. So the point is, this is not just a single purpose Tomcat instance. Some of these we ship, some we don't. Or some of these we ship extra for you, and you can create them. But yeah. And this applies to all of these other configurations. I'm going to show you how we set those up. One of the fun things about PaaS, or the nice thing, is you can build multiple ABL applications within a single instance. So what does that get you? Well, each of the ABL apps is pretty much its own, if you think of it, its own ProPath, its own set of databases, very, very broadly. That's kind of what defines it, with let's say, a security context around it. So you could run multiple of those in the same instance for various reasons. One is in a development machine. Do you really want to spin up a new Tomcat instance for every single thing you're testing and building? Probably not. Well, they don't give us machines powerful enough for that to do all of that. So that might be one use case. If you've got kind of a family of applications. You sell accounting software. You've got one application that does general ledger, one for accounts payable, one for accounts receivable. You could conceivably split up your application in pieces like that. The beauty of it is we can split it up another way as well. We'll get to that next. But remembering that ProPath and database connections and the AVM still works in PaaS the way it always worked in Classic App Server and any other server. So you've got to kind of just think a little bit about how you want to do that. If you're running a SaaS model, you may say, well, I'm going to have one PaaS instance for, let's say, 5 smaller customers, because that's going to be cheaper for me to run, to host, because they don't pay for higher levels of service. So you could potentially have 5 customers running in a single instance, separated by in individual ABL applications, or you could have one per. And that one per instance is really nice for scaling them out horizontally, because one of the really, really cool things about packaging up an instance is you just take the file system and you zip it up and you move it to another machine,
and you can run it. It can be really easily copied around and run. Well, you got to do one more command, but it's really easy to kind of just effectively cut and paste them across machines, across hosts, and spin them up. And where that becomes really more useful is when you start in 12, where you get some of the benefits of having better client-server connections to the database. I know right now one of the challenges is people have the machines, have the databases on the same machine that the app servers are on because they want to connect with shared memory connections. Once you stop doing that, once you use a client-server connection to the database, now you can scale these instances out as you want to. You can also have multiple, my example about the general ledger and the accounts payable, accounts receivable, you can do that a different way. Let's say those are just things you charge for differently or you secure differently. You can now split that up and say, well, actually, it's all the same code base. It's all the same set of databases. I'm just going to create one web app for general ledger, one web app for accounts payable, one web app for accounts receivable, and split it up that way. And that's nice because you can deploy, we'll see the deployment unit, we can deploy a web app individually. So that means we can optionally ship or not ship pieces of functionality. And the other nice thing about web apps is they are our security boundary, our authentication boundary. Every request into our instance has to come through a web app. There's no other way in to that server, to that running server. And so we can provide different levels of security for the same access in. So you may have for your, I'm just trying to think of a good example. You may have the same, let's say, orders orders is an easy one, that you let people see from the outside. So your customers can see their own orders, but your sales reps in-house can see everybody's orders, say. And you can control the access to those by saying, well, for my internal customers, my internal users, I want them to use Active Directory. I want them to use our local authentication. And so we can say, well, they're going to come in through web app A because we can secure that with Active Directory. But our customers, we want to use _user or an application database table, put the users in there, and we can say we can secure that other web app that way, all on the same code. So there's different ways of slicing and dicing this up. Just to highlight when they run, we have Tomcat and OpenEdge running. There's two processes that run, the Tomcat process and the agents, and that's all I'm going to say on it right now, because there's other talks about that level of detail. But then we run our instance in that, with the OpenEdge install. And we can do fun things, like I said, putting them behind a load balance or an API gateway or a router or whatever you want to do in the back of them. And our first the easiest way of deploying that is just to have a simple instance and effectively cut and paste it across all of the machines. So all of these are identical clones of the same application or applications running. All right, so how do we build one of these things to run, or how do we choose to build it? We've got a few layers. From the outside, the install, the instance itself. So an install is DLC, right? It's the executables that run your business logic. We run the code, run the database, run the PaaS instance, right? Run the agents. That all lives in DLC, where you know today. One install can support many instances. So an instance, as I said, an instance is effectively a runtime container of a business application. It does other things, but that's how I like to think about it. Within that, an instance can support one or more ABL applications. And an ABL application is well, I say your application is the application, right? It's the database connections. It's a ProPath. It's configuration around however you configure your application, right? You may use database tables. You may use XML to do configuration and that sort of stuff, right? This contains one or more ABL web apps, and the web apps are our way of exposing that application to the world, right? They're secured is important, and they contain a set of individual services that the world interacts with us. And within then, our smallest unit of deployment is the ABL service, which is an individual, in HTTP terms, I suppose, a resource or a set of resources being exposed. So again, if we have a web app that's for accounts receivable, we may have services around accounts receivable. And my accounting knowledge just left my brain completely. But smaller units, we'll just go there, right? Customers is probably, orders might be better, so you might have a service for customers and order lines or invoices within an orders thing, right? They're kind of associated bundles of stuff. So why are there many levels? Well, we don't really know how you want to deploy your applications, how you do it today. And we don't want to kind of limit you in that regard. And we don't want to force you and say, well, if you want to deploy it, you have to deploy it in this particular way. That doesn't work well either. So that's this kind of these multiple layers, and that's kind of where we're trying to lay out what's available. How do you decide which ones? That's a good question. And part of the answer is, how do you do it today? How many app servers do you have? How many web speed agents or servers do you have? How did you decide to split those up? So I know some people create 2 app servers for their clients, and one of which they run as an async one to do, GUI from the GUI. One runs normal logic, and one does other kind of batch jobs, if you will. Now, that's I suppose, a physical requirement on your definition that you may not need today. You may not need in PaaS because you can do all of those kinds of requests on a single instance. So that's kind of part of thinking of how you should split your application up and how you decide what to put in a package. Just another way of looking at it is from our URL space. So this is just example.com 8810/sports/rest customer service customers. The host and the port and the scheme are defined by the instance. The web app, or the web app is /sports and down, where the web app is the first segment there. And the web app is how the server knows which ABL application to run. That's kind of the linkage. So one web app can only run code for one ABL application. So if you wanted to have 2 ABL applications, you'd have sports and something else, right? You couldn't have the same URI going to 2 different things. That's not the way it's built. And then under that, REST, customer service, etc., this is the ABL service. And there's one of my pictures over here. This kind of part is owned and defined by developers, programmers, the web app names, the instance names. That tends to be in the hands of DevOps kind of engineers or administrators or deployers, right? They have control over those pieces. When you're writing code, you don't have any control about where the thing's deployed. Under it all is DLC, which is kind of owned by an administrator. In the application, there's a couple of bits as well around things like number of agents, number of sessions, timeouts, log levels, that sort of stuff, which is controlled by admins. And then within those application, we have people who write the code and run the databases or set the schemas, that sort of stuff. Okay. All right. So when we decide what we want to build from a package, there's a couple of requirements we have. And the first one for me anyway is trying to make it as small, well, it's kind of like as small as possible, but not too small unit, right? Each level, hopefully, you can see now has its own purpose in the stack, and you can choose how you want to deploy in that. They should be composable in my mind, so you can deploy a single instance all the time, and that's valid and fine, and it works well. But if you want to build applications out of more components, right? If you're selling a suite of products, do you want to ship everything and just you can ship everything and have people turn stuff on and off with license codes like Progress does, right? We do that. Everything is the install has everything and you flip the switch. Or you could have it in smaller pieces, which we're moving towards with, actually PaaS is, I think, the first product we landed up doing that, where we kind of bundle it as a separate product rather than a main product. So you want to be able to compose them into specialized bundles or specialized applications. And we want to be able to build them separately, and we want to be able to version them separately, right? We don't want to have to say, well, I'm changing one line of code. I have to rebuild from scratch the whole thing. I just want to build my service, or I just want to build my web app, or whatever the appropriate level is. The other requirement is that they really shouldn't be tightly coupled to specifically OpenEdge versions. Because now, when you're running multiple versions on your client sides, now you've got to build and maintain and keep checked into source control, the 11.6 version, the 11.7 version, whatever, the 12 version, right? And I don't think you want to do that. And then the other goal for me is they should be able to be produced and consumed in a CI/CD pipeline, untouched by human hands, including development time, right? No. So check in and check out, which kind of ties back to this being able to be built in small pieces and versioned independently. So if I check in a piece of code, I check in a change to my service and it breaks, doesn't compile, the CI/CD pipeline can still build from yesterday's pieces, still build a usable thing, so I don't impact other people that much. All right. So we're just going to walk down our levels a little bit and just see what kind of things we have today, what kind of things, how we can build those packages, how we can deploy them. So as I mentioned, in an instance, the easiest way is we zip up the whole folder structure, and it lives in its own separate folder structure that's not in DLC. We unzip it on a machine, we run the TC register command, and we start it. Boom. And any tailoring we have to do. That's the quickest, simplest, easiest way of deploying PaaS, or PaaS applications, right? But it's the biggest, most bundled up approach, right? It's not really composable. You could individually package stuff. What we want to do is we really want to move towards having a manifest, some kind of a description of what's this thing's name, what's its version, what does it depend on. There's properties files over here that control. OpenEdge properties file lives inside of the instance, and that's what replaced or replaces the ubroker properties, and that says things like, here's the propath, here's the database connections, this is how many agents you need to start up, this is your activate and your deactivate procedures, right? All of that sort of stuff, that's in the properties file. Logging is another important thing for the instance that you want to be able to control. You may have what I call your instance common ABL, so that's going to be stuff like if you've got XML parsing tools, or you've got utility code that's not really business application specific, but everything in your code base, all of the code in your application may need it. So that's framework code is another one, right? Standard web apps and scripts, as I said, standard web apps, your monitoring or your maintenance or those management, those kinds of things. On the deploy side, so we can take this and ship this in a package, right, a zip file, effectively. And on the other side, we say, well, TCMan creates a new instance. We can then merge properties. TCMan configures the Tomcat side of things rather than the OpenEdge side of things. We've got locations for the code, web apps, and then within there we want to say deploy the ABL application, run our tailoring again if we have any, and start. Okay. So there's kind of two distinct approaches. And they both have their pros and cons, right? Having the whole thing is quick and easy, and it works, right? You just drop it and run. Drop it, TCMan, deploy and run. The overlay package or the incremental package, however you want to think about that, is more work, and it requires you to have a target to overlay it on or to build on. The nice thing about the overlay package is it's only got what you've changed in a server, so it doesn't have doesn't need to have the standard stuff that we as Progress put in the instance, which you'll get if you do this. And that's which ties you more closely to an OpenEdge version. Now, there's nothing wrong in having both versions of these, right? In order to run something, you need this. You need the complete thing. Whether you build it on disk on your runtime environment, or whether you build it in your CI/CD pipeline and just ship it and run. You're going to need to build one of these before you can run anything. So potentially what you can do is have an overlay package built, and then when you decide what your deployment target is, platform, build up an instance, check that in and say, okay, well, here's my latest running version, here's the bit that built it up. So you can kind of stack them up, which may seem like a lot of work, but once you have once you have these things in place, now you can say, well, I've got version 3 of my instance, and that's got these things in, and I'm running it on 12, or I'm running it on 11.7 or whatever. On the ABL application side, kind of going down a bit, today we don't really have, we don't have a defined way of doing this. Is still very manually intensive. But again, you want those kinds of things, right? You want a manifest, you want properties files. Security, you can have security that applies to your whole ABL application. And then within there, you're going to have your business logic, obviously, and your connection parameters. Now, for packaging, I know that everybody, so when I say that, you go back a step, when we bundle and we pack up an instance and ship it around, that assumes a couple of things. One is that the database doesn't live on the same machine, which I mentioned. And the second one is that everything you need is in that instance, right? So that the ABL code for your business logic is in the instance as well. It doesn't have to be. It can be wherever it is today, and you can just point ProPath to it. But for kind of cleanliness or for being able to do some of these things, you need to know where that code is if you want to ship it and deploy it onto another machine. Scripts for tailoring on startup, on shutdown. And these are handy because you may want to say, hey, application has started, register me with a load balancer saying I'm ready for traffic or something, right? So kind of hooks into there. Yes? When does setup fire? It's a good question. Pardon? Yeah. It never fires, because as Dave points out, that's we don't actually have one like that. I'm trying to think of what I meant to write.
It does sound like a good idea to look at the tailoring.
Yeah, but startup, started, and shut up, those three. We'll just...
Sorry.
No, thank you for asking.
I had the same question, but I was too embarrassed to ask.
Yes. Yes. So no setup. That this is the setup step, and I'm just trying to. Yeah, it could be starting. So there's as the server comes up. Thanks, Chad. I keep my mouth shut now. Right. So scripts like that. The one thing to note is in an instance, I think we do get to that. In an instance, all of the properties, the configuration is held at the instance level. So even if it's defined for a web app or for an ABL application, it's still at runtime needs to get pushed up into the instance, because the instance is the thing that runs. It's really what its job is, and or controls the running. It's the container of running stuff. Web app has the same thing. We have a WAR file, and there's scripts in PDSOE, and there's scripts that can take a project that looks like a PDSOE, a file system that looks like a PDSO project, and create a WAR file, a web app out of that, and you just deploy that into a running or not running instance, which is kind of nice. Alternatively, building up an incremental file with these kind of things, I can walk through all of them, but what a web app is going to have security, right? Remember I said the web app is the boundary of authentication, so you want to put your security there. And then the stuff in it is going to be what are the services it exposes, and again, tailoring, static files, that sort of stuff with tcman to do that. Right? So you'll see tcman deploy a lot. OEProp is kind of like merge props in the classic app server world, where it just takes a snippet of properties and merges them up into the instances properties file. SecProp does the same for security properties. Within there, we have a service, and the one thing I failed to mention earlier on our URL was you could see in the service name, there was kind of, it said /REST. I talked about REST and web handlers. We have what we call transports, which is just a way of splitting up the traffic, if you will, for what we call REST. REST and web are fundamentally the same thing. REST, web, SOAP. APSV is the old AIA for ABL clients. And those are the four, and then there's a static set of files as well. And so each of those four transports has its own, I call them service descriptor. It's a thing called a PAR file, a progress application archive. Right, Dave? That's what we call them, yeah. WSM is for SOAP stuff, handlers files, whatever those might be, your service descriptors, which is the, what does this service do, right? Where do I take a request? If I get a request on this URL, where does it have to go? That's effectively that. Properties and security around that, and static files, right? So this is our smallest level of thing. So those are kind of the logical packages. So, yeah, so where does all of this stuff come from? Now, you probably won't be able to see this. This is a PaaS-OE project. Well, the next talk in here is at 2:45, so I've got you here till you will lynch me and eat me, I think. A PaaS-OE project has a couple of parts. Sorry, a PDS-OE project has a couple of pieces. Today, there's an app server directory, which is published into the ABL application code. That's kind of the only artifacts we have on that. All of these ABL service facets, if you say I want an ABL service, you get one of those folders with the default name of app server. You can call it what you want, and you can publish it where you want. But that's what that does. There's a folder called PaaS-OE content, which is effectively the web app level stuff. So it can be exported or deployed as a complete web app. Right, so this is kind of what you're going to be wanting to do, I think, for, you can script it as well with Ant today. And you're going to kind of want to bundle this in and check that, at some level, check either a zip file version of it or the complete web app into your artifact repository or your source control, right? That's one level of versioning, because this says, here's my services, here's the security model for them, etc. At the way down the bottom here, there's a thing called defined services, and this is the list of services, ABL services inside of the web app. So that's how they, and obviously when you export those, we take the services along for the ride because they're important. On the ABL service level, you can export only for REST files, a PAR file, which is, as I said, the archive. So today we can do that as an independent unit. SOAP you still create with ProxyGen, those WSM files. All right, so where does it go? So looking on a file system level, where do we put this? DLC is wherever it is, right? Bin directory contains your executables, and inside of DLC there's a service PaaS-OE directory, which is Catalina home, which is the executables for the Tomcat instance, the PaaS instance. Okay. In this extras directory is a bunch of, I mentioned earlier, the standard web apps, OE manager stuff. They live under here in the extras. Within an instance directory, so this is our instance. As I mentioned, I'll just repeat it again. It lives separately from DLC. And this is, again, this gets hooked up back to that Catalina base when you register it or you create it. And it's got, conf is important. Conf and logs you'll get to know well when you work with PaaS. Logs, the log files go into the logs directory, as you would expect. And conf is where the properties live, right? So if you're going to go fiddle with properties manually, this is where you want to be doing it. We should be doing it. That contains ABL apps. It's got an OpenEdge directory where we could put our instance common logic and the web apps. So while the web apps are logically children of an ABL app, they live inside of the PaaS instance up here. And there's no real reason why they couldn't be made, have an ABL app that lives underneath here. It's just work that we haven't done yet. In the ABL apps directory, we have the ABL app. And this is the least well-defined of the structures we have on disk, largely because, well, again, just working through that. But in here, I would expect you to put your ABL code for the application, etc., whatever that might be. Point ProPath to here, etc. And from here, this is a conf directory with where we have security. I mentioned we could do security settings for the whole ABL application. So if you wanted to have a standard authentication scheme for the whole, for all of the web apps in your application, that's where you would configure it, and that would apply to all of them, which is kind of a trickle down. Yeah. In our web apps directory, OE manager is, as I mentioned, but root is the default one. You always get a root web app. And inside of that, we have some static files and bits and pieces. But as I mentioned, repeat myself, authorization happens here. Sorry, authentication happens here primarily. Authorization too. And this contributes up into the instance properties, and it contributes. And you can have, I should say, we can have in the webinf directory, we can have properties, security properties as well. This is a container, if you will, of the ABL service, which tend to live under this adapters thing. They either live in adapters or in OpenEdge, depending on the style. Web handlers are ABL code, so they'll live in an OpenEdge directory. The PAR files and SOAP live in the adapters directory. So it kind of just trickles down. Yeah, I mentioned services already. And within the ABL services, they vary, as I say. You'll see in the rest, there's a PAR file over here that's got a lot of XML nested inside, even more XML properties around that, and then OpenEdge will have, if you've ever had a look inside there, you'll get a headache. And this contributes kind of two things up. One is code into the web app, and the other is intercept URLs, which is authorization settings. Right? So I only want managers to be able to see salaries, for instance. So you can apply that authorization here in the service file. And just a recap of it kind of on top. That owns that, that owns that, and that owns that. Right? So just to try and have it on one file. I mentioned that the properties get rolled up into the instance properties in Catalina base. So that's where I mentioned Catalina home. Catalina base is the instances root directory. In this directory here, PASOE instance 1, that's Catalina base. So you'll see a lot of references in the properties files and in our literature documentation talking about Catalina base. That's it. And each instance has its own Catalina base. And so we can see different stuff gets pushed up. So the apps, does it work? My pointy thing doesn't work. So there's kind of a section for the instance. There's 3 or 4 sections for the ABL application. So things like web apps, right? What are the web apps that belong to this ABL application? It's important. You can see the heritage of the classic app server in kind of this session manager versus agent sections. So each of these kind of sections has a name. The conference is our ABL application. These are for the so our startup params, our ProPath, whatever. The web apps, is it enabled, disabled? And then within the web apps, service level stuff. So each of these deployment levels has its own place in the properties file, but it's all rolled up into one big properties file for runtime. So when the instance starts, it only reads this file. It doesn't care about any of the others or wherever they came from. Okay, so that's where we are today. You may have noticed some hand waving about we'd like to have certain bits of it. And part of the goals here as well is to kind of make this crisper and more well-defined. So the packages we talked about in terms of, I'll go back to one, like here, maybe more this one, right? We can only build a package for a PAR file, for a REST service, and even that isn't enough for the whole service. So that just says, here's the URI mappings, right? But the security stuff doesn't go along with that. And the ABL service interface code behind it doesn't go along with that. So working to work our way, kind of defining that, deploying that, so we can script this stuff out and say, if you've got a thing like this, do a deploy of this, and it'll do the right stuff, just to make it easier for you to deploy at the various levels. Manifest-based, so we can version it intelligently. And our goal is to make that around the whole CI/CD workflow, right? We have an internal initiative to get to 5 nines. I'm sure you've heard plenty of people talk about it already, but this kind of feeds into that, right? You can't have always uptime if you have to take servers down and you've got to go scratch around in the guts of them to do stuff. So what that means in the future is more, for instance, for our services over here, right, it's going to have the properties, it's going to have a manifest, it's going to have everything it needs to be a single unit. So that's our goal, and we're working towards doing that. And that'll get rolled out, I think, over time, whenever we get Dave and Mike away from conferences and back to work. So in conclusion, I walked through what are the deployment levels of an instance, like including services, ABL services, which is unfortunately or fortunately the really tippy top or the bottom of the whole pile. And then hopefully just talked through how you can deploy them, what should go into each of these packages, at any given time. There's other sessions that may be interesting in kind of this beyond the code concept, I suppose I should explain, is we kind of thought, well, you've got code out there in your applications. How do you use that in a quote-unquote modern application architecture, modern world? And so these sessions tend to talk about them. See, Chad even gets I should take your name off for pointing me out earlier, but Chad over here has got a session. I encourage you go and listen to the one about Spring, because that's one of the real big reasons to go to PAS. And with that, I think I have like 5 minutes-ish for questions. So, yes. So in this world, especially in the application side, the runtime, the configuration, we still use ProPath. We still use all of the connection settings. So if you've got your application code in one place, you can just say, ProPath, go look over there. And in that way, you could potentially have classic app servers and PAS servers pointing to the same R code and the same set of databases. That doesn't change.
So do we need to restart or anything, or it's casting and all that?
You got a question or a comment?
Yeah, so one of the...
So just to recap for the recording, the question is about, do we have to shut down the server to redeploy R code? And the answer was
yes, except for 12.
yes, except in 12, where we have a dynamic ProPath thing. Are there any other? With the dynamic ProPath, the question was, will classes and persistent procedures get cleaned up? The answer is, I think so. Yeah.
We go through a full session shutdown procedure. The
Yeah.
session goes away, and the session gets brought up, session startup procedure gets run.
Yeah. And again, so as Dave said, at 2:45, he's got a whole session on this, so we can go. Any other questions or comments? And now I'm getting please remind you to fill in the app or the survey. And yeah, I'll be around if you have questions or comments. And thank you very much for your time.